Hello everybody. Today we're going to go over third-party APIs. Oftentimes you'll want to communicate with technology other than your script or the suppliers. So you want to use external tools. Things like Google Translate APIs, ChatGPT APIs, or even Google Search APIs. Let's take our example from Part 6. And let's say we want to give a variant of this description. So let's take the description, write clean select, and now I'll write GPT question. And before writing my prompt, I'll use ChatGPT to test the prompt. Something like this should do it, but I can always modify it. Once I have something I'm happy with, I can replace the description with what I want. I'm going to have the API key. You can find that on the documentation for this function. We can also see that we can choose a different model. By default, we use ChatGPT 3.5, but we can change models. Based on the model that we choose, the output can be longer or shorter, and the costs will vary. We can check out the pricing for each of these different models, and we have to calculate the cost per token for one product, then multiply that by the amount of total products. I'd like to remind you that though we are focused on e-commerce for this tutorial series, Grimport can also be used for other web mining purposes. It can be used for all kinds of domains. We can also use the playground to test the different parameters. For example, the model, among others. Now, temperature is for how creative we want the AI to be, and max tokens is the maximum length for an answer. We can set max tokens to be low in order to not use too much tokens and be wasteful. A token is about a word. Timeout is how long we wait before assuming ChatGPT gave no answer. Debug returns the JSON response sent by the API. And delay between requests gives the delay between ChatGPT requests to avoid getting kicked for going over their limits. You can see the limits here, and in particular, we want the RPM, or requests per minute. Once we have the description, we can add it to our update function. Now, this is a bit wasteful because we're calling the API every time we go over the product. So we will add an if statement to not call this API every time. Sometimes ChatGPT can go down. Actually, any API can go down. Sometimes it's because of bugs or errors. Sometimes it's maintenance. Whatever the reason, that means that sometimes when we run GPT question, we get null back. This means that sometimes we may create products without descriptions. To remedy this, instead of checking if the product exists, we will check instead if the description exists. That way, we'll create it if it doesn't exist yet, and do nothing if it does. We have other APIs, like translator APIs. So for these, we'll need a token again, and we'll have to call the setDepotAccess function to be able to use depot. Then use translateDepot. We can translate this description to English, for example. It is recommended to use APIs that are already implemented with Grimport. You can of course add other APIs, but the currently implemented ones also deal with timeouts and the different ways that each API returns their answers. But still, let's say we want to create an origami API to update a product variant. For this endpoint, we'll have to first get the link of the endpoint. It says here that we need to put our website URL here and the product ID here. Okay. We'll have to send a post request. Now, sometimes we can use a map with a key and value, like for logins. But usually, it'll be more complex than that. So, for that, we'll have to use JSON. For these, we'll use post body. Now, for our website, we'll call it www.testwebsite.com. Then the endpoints, and then the product ID. Origami's product ID will be different than the one on PrestaShop. But then, this is just a tutorial, so we're going to be lazy and assume that it's the same ID, even though it doesn't have to be. We can only do this if the product exists, so if statement. Now, for the body, let's see. We'll have to put some of these parameters in, so let's just use JSON encode. Then our parameters. According to the doc, only the first is required, just the product ID. The others are optional. We can update the reference here. We'll do this for this tutorial. Now, we can notice that this isn't actually a post that we have to do. It's a patch. So, we'll have to change that to be a patch using the HTTP header function, request method, patch. We'll also need header. This one is already configured in the post body. We can see this here. For the authorization, we can add an HTTP header. Bearer, and now we need an origami token. Pro tip, put your tokens at the beginning of the code to neatly organize them. and add with variable to be able to easily modify them later. Now we just need the context, and we just need the user ID. So I'll put 1 here. Now, when we run this request, the API will return the body, seen here. So I need a variable to store the results. Usually, the JSON isn't this structured. It will be compact. Something like this. We can use a JSON parser to unclutter the JSON. Anyway, if we want to access an element from the JSON, we first have to start by decoding the JSON. Then, if we want, say, the depth, since this is a map because of the curly braces, then we write depth. If we want the ID here, we have to first write attribute values. Then, we have a list. You can tell because of the square brackets. We need the first and only element of the list, which is a map. See the curly brackets. Finally, we'll access the ID's value. We can use the get function for this. So, to restate, we access the map, go to attribute values, get the first element, access ID. Moving on, there is also an API to search Google. Let's search for the product. Looking at the documentation, I'd like to highlight the fact that we can use Firefox to search Google to load the JavaScript. There's also an internal request that doesn't do this for efficiency, though that creates problems of its own. By default, it's Firefox, for good reason. So, when we get the results for this search, we get a list of results with the name of the search, with the URL and description. To demonstrate, let's put a console to show the first result. The first site selling this product is, then a get to get the first result. And now I have a rough approximation of my biggest competitor for this product. We can also interface with third-party programs. Sometimes we want to interact not with APIs, but programs on our desktop. If we want to, for example, activate NordVPN, then I can write this shell command in order to do so. I just write send command line followed by the shell command. If we want to do more than shell commands to interact with programs, for example with an ERP, well, that's not really doable with a shell command. For that, we'll have to simulate keyboard and mouse commands. We'll use the interact function, which launches AutoHotKey or PyAutoGUI on Linux. So, in the example here, we can see that we launch Notepad, we focus on that window, we wait for a new untitled window to pop up, and we write my text before right-clicking. We can also see a detailed list of commands that AutoHotKey takes. And of course, they also have documentation. If we want to find a button in particular, we'll do find a text to find a specific text. There are tutorials on this. So let's just take the example and copy and paste it into our code. We can instead write the description here, making sure to replace send with send raw. This is just in case there are control characters. If we want to interact with databases, we can use SQL query. We'll need a driver and a connection URL. Let's say we're using MySQL. We'll copy and paste this as well, replace the host with an address, give a database name, login, password, and here I'll put my SQL request. Now, based on my query, I may have a return value. Here, because I am using insert into, I shouldn't type in set or row because I'm not searching for a set or a row of information. Instead, I'll use execute, as mentioned here on the page. If I instead do select, I can select an entire set or specifically one row of information. I can also return the ID of the entry for insert. Finally, I can also upload data with FTP upload. Important. If you need to do something, search through the functions to see if it doesn't already exist yet. Anyway, if I want to upload by FTP, we can see the documentation. You need the server IP, the log information, the location on the server where the file will be saved, and the location of the file locally. There are different protocols, FTP or SFTP if you have SSH. Thank you for listening. This concludes part 9 of this series.